yes, Russia invaded and attacked Ukraine. It is something that threatens to be a calamity for the people of that country and also for the people of Russia. That's a fact we can't change, the fact that Russia attacked. The thing we can change is, what is the response? Is the response to escalate more war, or is it to seek a different approach? And I've been raising some of these questions on social media, and I get the same responses after 9/11. If you ask the question, how did we get here? You're accused of, well, you're justifying what Putin did. You're taking the side of Russia. I can't claim, I wasn't smart enough to predict what happened. In fact, I'll admit I didn't think Russia would invade Ukraine in the way that it has. But some people were smart. For example, John Mearsheimer. People have been seeing that clip of.
Yeah, if you want, I can actually play it real quick.
Let's play it. This is John Mearsheimer, who is a well-known political scientist. Yeah, yes, from 2015. 2015. Right. So this was a year after the U.S.-sponsored coup in Ukraine, when far-right elements, including Right Sector and the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion, were weaponized by the United States to overthrow the government and install what the US thought would be a more pliable one. But yeah, let's go ahead and take a look.
But I actually think that what's going on here is that the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. And the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked. And I believe that the policy that I'm advocating, which is neutralizing Ukraine and then building it up economically and getting it out of the competition between Russia on one side and NATO on the other side, is the best thing that could happen to the Ukrainians. What we're doing is encouraging the Ukrainians to play tough with the Russians. We're encouraging the Ukrainians to think that they will ultimately become part of the West, because we will ultimately defeat Putin and we will ultimately get our way. Time is on our side. And of course, the Ukrainians are playing along with this. And the Ukrainians are almost completely unwilling to compromise with the Russians and instead want to pursue a hardline policy. Well, as I said to you before, if they do that, the end result is that their country is going to be wrecked. And what we're doing is, in effect, encouraging that outcome. I think it would make much more sense for us to work to create a neutral Ukraine. It would be in our interest to bury this crisis as quickly as possible. It certainly would be in Russia's interest to do so. And most importantly, it would be in Ukraine's interest to put an end to the crisis. Thank you.
Just this is all to say, there's a real reason for this crisis, which John Mearsheimer talked about, which I'm sure, Ali, you probably have more to say about. But if you're watching CNN, if you're reading the New York Times, if you're reading the Washington Post, you would think that Russia just suddenly invaded Ukraine out of nowhere, totally unprovoked. And this is not to justify anything, but like you said, Ali, things don't just happen in a vacuum. They happen for a reason, and we have to ask why. Because if you don't ask why, you can't come to a resolution. You can't figure out how to de-escalate this and solve it. So as you've been watching this play out, what is your perspective, your analysis on why this happened and how we got here? And do you fear it could get much worse?
Yes, I fear it could get much worse. I fear it could get catastrophically worse, not just for the people in Ukraine, but for the whole world. And I get the sense that a lot of people who are too young to remember the Cold War and the real fear of nuclear annihilation that the world lived through don't understand that, or have a hard time perceiving the difference between reality and entertainment. And they talk about this like it's an MMA bout or a video game. And it's incredibly dangerous. And one thing you hear all the time, one of the so-called grievances that Vladimir Putin has is the expansion of NATO. And there's been a lot of revisionist history about the expansion of NATO because, for example, PolitiFact, one of these fact-checking sites I looked at just a little while ago, Russia says that they were promised that NATO would not expand after the Cold War. And now PolitiFact is out there spinning it and saying, well, there's no treaty saying NATO won't expand. So what's the reality here? So one place people can get that reality is from the National Security Archive at George Washington University. And I don't know if that's something we can put up now,
Yeah,
just
I'll work
to
on
show
it.
people they can go and read it themselves. But there were multiple assurances given to the Soviet Union in 1990 and afterwards, and this is all detailed in this brief from the National Security Archive that's based on declassified documents. These were multiple verbal assurances, but communicated clearly to the Soviet Union that if the Soviet Union allowed the reunification of Germany in 1990, that NATO would not be expanded, that NATO troops would be able to enter into the eastern part of Germany, into the former East Germany that would become united with West Germany, but not beyond that. And that's one of the points that Putin has been making constantly. From that time, from before Putin was leader, the Soviets feared the expansion of NATO. So,
yeah, just real quick. I mean, I know I'm scrolling through it. It's a lot of language, but this is literally outlining each time
yes,
the U.S.
yeah,
and showing photos of the year and the U.S. leader that made this promise and when and to who.
Right,
so.
because there's this revisionist attempt now to say, oh, none of this ever happened. But some of the, most significant international agreements or understandings aren't necessarily documented in a treaty. But this was the understanding that was made. Then, in the Clinton period, under President Clinton, the United States began to talk about expanding NATO with some of the former Warsaw Pact countries and Eastern Europe. Today, there are countries that were actually part of the Soviet Union, like Belarus and Ukraine. They were part of the Soviet Union, and there were countries that were not part of the Soviet Union, but allied with it under the Warsaw Pact, countries like Poland and Hungary and Bulgaria and others. So in the 90s, the talk about NATO expansion started. And in this piece in the New York Times recently, Tom Friedman says NATO expansion was a mistake. But he says that in 1998, after the Senate ratified NATO expansion, he called George Kennan, the architect of America's successful containment policy of the Soviet Union. George Kennan is perhaps the most famous US Cold Warrior. He was the architect of the US policy, well known to people who know this history. And he asked Kennan, then aged 94, what was his opinion of NATO expansion? And I want people to keep in mind what John Mearsheimer said about Ukraine that we just heard a few minutes ago, and keep this in mind with what George Kennan, the biggest American Cold Warrior, told Tom Friedman, our least favorite New York Times columnist, in 1998. And I think it's worth reading all or most of this answer.
Please, yes.
Quoting Kennan. In 1998, I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves. That shows you kind of the mindset of George Kennan, not a woke leftist.
Right.
He continues, We have signed up to protect a whole series of countries, even though we have neither the resources nor the intention to do so in any serious way. NATO expansion was simply a light-hearted action by a Senate that has no real interest in foreign affairs. What bothers me is how superficial and ill-informed the whole Senate debate was. I was particularly bothered by the references to Russia as a country dying to attack Western Europe. Don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime, and now we are turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime, and Russia's democracy is as far advanced, if not further, as any of these countries we've just signed up to defend from Russia. Of course, there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that is how the Russians are. But this is just wrong. So that's George Kennan. Now, he says something there. He says there's no reason for NATO expansion. I actually want to suggest there was a reason for NATO expansion, because I remember at the end of the Cold War, there was all this talk of a peace dividend, that all the huge amounts of money that was spent on keeping huge US forces and garrisons in Western Europe could now be drawn down. And in fact, they were drawn down. Ultimately, as we know, the US defense budget, I think it did actually even fall for a couple of years. I'll have to check that. But then, we know that it just keeps rising and rising now. And 9/11 was the great boost. But there was a reason for NATO expansion, because if the US spending on large-scale weapon systems from Raytheon, from Boeing, from Lockheed Martin, from General Dynamics, and so on, is going to go down, well, you need new markets. And what happens? You have this concept in NATO called interoperability, which means that all the NATO forces basically use similar equipment on the same standard. So if you're going to admit Poland, which was a member of the Warsaw Pact, or Hungary, or the Baltic states, which were actually part of the Soviet Union, and so on, all of these countries' militaries were equipped with Soviet equipment. So now you need to completely refit them from the ground up with NATO equipment. So there was a massive economic incentive to expand NATO, to create new markets for these companies that feared. Ultimately, they didn't really see a loss in market share, but they did have reason to believe that the US would be buying less tanks and warplanes and what have you. So this is how we got there. This is how we got to where we are. As you said, that doesn't justify Russia's attack, but nor can we ignore the conditions that have led us to this point. And the question is, what do we do? What do we do now? And I say we as on a number of levels, we as a part of a country, but we also as individuals and people concerned. The drive now is towards escalation. What should have happened after this Russian invasion is that there should have been a massive mobilization of international diplomacy with the United States, with China, with the European Union to stop the war. First and foremost, to stop the war, to spare people's lives, to spare Ukraine from destruction, and to begin a political process that would resolve, the Europeans and the Americans, they constantly lecture Palestinians and others. Violence isn't a solution. There's no solution to your problems except a political solution. Okay, fine. I say to the Europeans, there is no solution to your problems except a political solution.
It's true. Yeah.
So what did they do instead? There has been no diplomacy. There's been no conversations between President Biden and Putin. There's been no real effort. There's been posturing and shows at the UN Security Council, but no actual effort to resolve this conflict. The immediate conflict, the precipitating factors, which include the war in the Donbass region that has been going on since 2014 with massive loss of life, and the bigger question of Ukrainian neutrality and security, because Ukrainians deserve security and they deserve peace. Remember, by the way, we talked about the division and reunification of Germany. After World War II, the Soviet Union wanted a neutral Germany. They wanted a neutral Germany because Germany had just done,
horrible,
got done with Hitler. So they
Yes.
said a neutral Germany. The Americans refused a neutral Germany. And that's what cemented the partition of Germany into West Germany and East Germany. And then in the early 1950s, the United States, for the first few years after the war, the United States, West Germany was disarmed. In the 1950s, the United States began rearming Germany. And by the way, some of the top officers who helped found the Bundeswehr, the modern German military, were Nazis. That's another story. That's a story for another day. The point now that I want to say is that there are alternatives to escalation, but it would mean taking seriously the idea of diplomacy, of negotiation, of resolving comprehensively the issues that have been concerning both Russia and other countries since the end of the Cold War, that the United States and its allies have just steamrolled from the beginning. But the alternative now that is being taken, and we are all being propagandized into supporting it, is escalation, is feeding Ukrainians as cannon fodder into a proxy war with Russia. And that's what Adam Schiff wants to do. Democrat Adam Schiff wants to do. We help Ukraine fight Russia over there so we don't have to fight Russia over here. How are we going to fight Russia over here? Russia's not going to invade the United States. This isn't about protecting the US. It's about expanding US influence and empire. So what's the model here? And this is what people need to understand. The model is Afghanistan. And people are being explicit about it. What happened with Afghanistan after the Soviets entered Afghanistan in 1979 to support the communist government in Afghanistan? Zbigniew Brzezinski, the US National Security Advisor to President Carter, devised the policy to start supporting an insurgency. These were the so-called Mujahideen, the precursor to Al-Qaeda, the people the US says did 9/11. So they were being armed. Pakistan became the staging ground for this. Billions of dollars of weapons, CIA operatives, everything you want going through Pakistan into Afghanistan, feeding the people of that country into a meat grinder in order to defeat the Soviet Union. In 1997, Brzezinski, in an interview with CNN, explained the strategy. And I quote him. He said the goal was to make the Soviet Union bleed as much as possible for as long as possible. But it wasn't just the Soviet Union that bled. It was the people of Afghanistan who bled. And who now we pretended to care about Afghan women and girls for 5 minutes, or whenever the US needed to reinforce public and political support for intervention in Afghanistan, people start screaming about Afghan women and girls. Where are all those people in the media who are now screaming about Ukraine? Why aren't they talking about the millions of people starving in Afghanistan now, just months after the US left? And I want to just to close my sort of overview with this point here. In the past few days, I've read articles. For example, I wrote an article at the Electronic Intifada on this matter. And one of the articles I quote is from someone called James Bruno, writing in the Washington Monthly. James Bruno was a State Department diplomat or employee in the 1980s who helped implement that make them bleed policy in Afghanistan. And he wrote an article, I forget the headline, but I remember the first sentence. It was that we have made Mother Russia bleed before, and we can do it again. And he goes on to say, we need to support an insurgency in Ukraine. We need to do exactly what we did in Afghanistan. You know who the other person I heard saying that was on Maddow?
Hillary Clinton.
Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton.
Just said these things.
Hillary Clinton. I don't know if you have that clip or if we.
I don't, but I could get it.
Yeah, but in other words, so this is what they want. They are ready to fight to the last drop of Ukrainian blood, and their allies in this, of course, the Ukrainian people don't deserve any of this. They're not to blame for what Russia has done. They're not to blame for what the United States has done to their country. They don't deserve any of this. But let's be clear about who the allies of the United States have been in Ukraine. They have been hardcore right elements. The Azov battalion, outright Nazis, the Banderites, the people who worship Stepan Bandera, the Nazi collaborator who helped exterminate huge numbers of Jews and Poles in Western Poland during World War II. These are their support. These are their moderate rebels in Ukraine, actual Nazis. And now, when you hear the British government and the Danish government and others telling their citizens, and this propaganda is being encouraged in the Western media, telling their citizens, you can go fight in Ukraine. Who do you think is going to go and fight in Ukraine? Do you think it's going to be just like the ordinary? Yeah, I've already seen some propagandistic news reports of like this one guy who's just an ordinary guy from the UK who's going to go over to Ukraine, has no military experience. Maybe there'll be a few people like that, but I'll tell you who will go to Ukraine. It's going to be the far right, the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists who are already attracted to Ukraine by the Azov battalion. And they're going to go there. And then the blowback is just so predictable. You're going to have these battle-hardened neo-Nazis go back to Germany and France and Denmark and Norway and wherever they are and unleash hell on Muslims, on people from Africa, on anyone that they consider not to be a true European. And this is all unfolding before our eyes, and people, including many people on the left, are all cheering it on. And the thing I'm asking people to do is stop a minute. You know, your emotions, the whole thing, all this war propaganda is designed to make you emotional. It's designed to make you feel anger at the injustice of what is happening. It's designed to make you designed to make you say, something must be done. We have to help these people. What's not designed to make you do is to stop and think. People really need to stop and think and not be propagandized and not allow their emotions to be manipulated into pushing them to support another Hillary Clinton war, another Joe Biden war.
Yeah.
Another war that at the end of it, Ukraine will be destroyed and the people will be forgotten, just like the people of Afghanistan, of Iraq, of Yemen, of Libya, of Palestine, of Gaza, of all these countries that one after the other are destroyed and devastated in the name of in the name of bringing freedom or whatever it is. I don't even know what we're supposed to be bringing anymore. It's certainly not healthcare. No. Why isn't there a massive effort from the so-called friends of of Ukraine to say, negotiate, we'll have your back. There could be a decent negotiation if you consider that on the one side you have Russia, on the other side, yes, Ukraine is much weaker, but if it had the Europeans supporting it, and the United States offering its support, you could have a fairly balanced negotiation that would lead to a political solution. But
they don't want one.
But they don't want one because the negotiations that Zelensky clearly wants and that Russia is willing to engage in with whatever motives is being treated as a sideshow. It's not being treated as the what should be the center, which is to end this war. First, stop the bombing, stop the killing, stop the destruction. No Ukrainian, no Russian. People have been saying no Russian mother wants her son to die in Ukraine. It's true. Which mother wants that? Stop the bloodshed, but bring a durable political solution to this long festering issue. And I say again to Europeans that they need to live by the creed they preach to the rest of the world, although they don't ever live by, which is violence is not a solution to your problems. You have to find a political solution.
People forget the US basically occupies Germany. Germany is essentially like at the mercy of the US in so many ways.
All of Western Europe, they're all vassals.
Exactly.
Look, I mean,
these aren't sovereign countries.
Yeah, I was looking at this the other day. I sort of wanted to update my knowledge. I mean, the West Europeans have no real military capacity. They have air forces which were developed not for fighting wars in Europe, but for bombing third world countries, which they've done because all these NATO countries, joined in Libya and Afghanistan and, Syria, wherever. But they don't have land armies because they don't anticipate that they're going to have to fight to defend their homeland. So all their toughness, and their belligerence towards Russia and all that is from hiding behind the skirts of the United States. And, Donald Trump, who we all revile and hate, when he was complaining, the Europeans don't do anything, we pay for everything, he was right. Because, the Netherlands and Germany and Belgium, I mean, I think that their actual combat troops, if you put it together, is probably like the size of the Chicago Police Department.
Yeah, maybe not even.
Maybe not even.